The autumn of 1964 arrived in New York, the way it always arrived, with a quality of urgency that other cities did not possess, as if the season itself understood that New York had no patience for gradual transition and preferred its changes sudden and complete. And Frank Sinatra was in a taxi on Fifth Avenue at 7:30 in the evening, watching the city rearrange itself from its daytime configuration into its nighttime one, watching the office workers heading towards subway entrances, while the restaurant crowds were beginning to form on the sidewalks outside establishments that would not have empty tables until well past midnight. And Frank Sinatra was on his way to a dinner at a private club in the East 50 that he did not particularly want to attend, but had agreed to because the man hosting the dinner was someone who had done Frank Sinatra a genuine service in 1957, and to whom Frank Sinatra therefore owed the occasional presence at a dinner table regardless of whether the guest list was interesting. And Frank Sinatra was thinking about none of this because his mind was occupied with something that had happened that afternoon in a recording studio on West 44th Street, during a session that had started badly and gotten worse, and had eventually produced nothing usable, which in itself was not unusual. Sessions failed all the time, but what had happened in this particular failed session had a quality that stayed with Frank Sinatra in the taxi, in a way that a merely technical failure would not have, because what had happened was this. A young arranger named Philip Cross, who was 24 years old, and who had been brought into the session by Frank Sinatra's regular arranger as an assistant, a gesture intended to give the young man professional experience and exposure, had made a suggestion during a run-through that had been immediately dismissed by two senior musicians in the room with the specific casual cruelty that the music industry sometimes deployed against people who were young and not yet established. And Philip Cross had absorbed the dismissal without visible reaction and had continued his work for the remainder of the session with complete professionalism. And Frank Sinatra had watched this happen and had said nothing at the time because the session was going badly enough without introducing a confrontation about how suggestions were received. But in the taxi afterward, Frank Sinatra was still thinking about it, still turning over the specific quality of what he had witnessed, because the suggestion Philip Cross had made had not been a bad one, had in fact been interesting, had been the kind of observation that came from someone with genuine musical intelligence rather than mere technical proficiency, and the dismissal had been about the young man's position in the room rather than about the quality of his idea. And Frank Sinatra found this particular form of injustice more irritating than most because it was so efficient in its waste, so perfectly designed to eliminate exactly the kind of thinking that sessions needed. Philip Cross had grown up in Baltimore, the son of a high school music teacher, and had arrived in New York 2 years earlier with a composition degree from the Peabody Conservatory, and the kind of theoretical knowledge that conservatories produced, and the kind of practical ignorance about how the industry actually worked that conservatories also produced. And he had been finding his way into session work through his connection to Frank Sinatra's regular arranger, who had recognized Philip's abilities early and had been trying in an informal way to position him for a career. And Philip had been doing everything correctly, showing up prepared and learning from observation, and keeping his opinions to himself until he felt he had earned the right to offer them. And the suggestion he had made that afternoon in the session on West 44th Street had been offered carefully and with appropriate deference, and the response it had received had been designed not merely to reject the suggestion, but to remind Philip Cross of where he stood in the hierarchy. And this distinction between rejecting an idea and rejecting the person who offered it was the distinction that Frank Sinatra was thinking about in the taxi, the distinction between a professional environment that was appropriately rigorous and one that was merely protecting existing arrangements of power. The dinner was everything Frank Sinatra had expected it to be, which was to say pleasant enough and unmemorable. The host was grateful for Frank Sinatra's presence. The food was good. The other guests were a mixture of business people and one or two entertainment industry figures, and a political figure whose name Frank Sinatra was surprised to see on the guest list. And Frank Sinatra ate and drank moderately and said the things that were required of him in each conversation, and left at 10 o'clock with the comfortable feeling of an obligation discharged. And in the car on the way back to his hotel, he made a decision that he had been approaching all evening without quite committing to, which was that he was going to call Philip Cross the following morning and offer him a commission. The commission Frank Sinatra had in mind was real and not invented as a pretext. It was for a set of new arrangements of 4 standards that Frank Sinatra had been considering recording for an upcoming project, arrangements that his regular arranger had been too busy to write, and for which Frank Sinatra had not yet found the right person. And the reason Frank Sinatra had Philip Cross in mind for this commission, rather than any of the more established arrangers he could have called, was not purely strategic, was not simply an attempt to give the young man an opportunity, but was also genuinely musical, because the suggestion Philip Cross had made that afternoon in the failed session had shown an understanding of harmonic possibility that Frank Sinatra wanted to see applied to actual material, wanted to hear what Philip Cross would do with real songs and real latitude. And so the commission was legitimate from every angle, a genuine professional offer made to someone whose abilities Frank Sinatra had assessed and found promising. The call happened at 9 the following morning, Frank Sinatra's assistant placing it to a number obtained from Philip's arranger mentor, with a brief explanation of why the number was needed. And when Philip Cross answered his phone in his apartment in the West Village and heard that Frank Sinatra was on the line, his response was a silence of approximately 4 seconds that communicated everything about what it felt like to receive such a call at 24 years old, 2 years into a career that had not yet reached any point of security. And when Frank Sinatra explained the commission, Philip Cross said, "I need to make sure I understand. You want me specifically for this, not as an assistant." And Frank Sinatra said, "I want you specifically, not as an assistant." And Philip said, "Can I ask why?" And Frank Sinatra said, "Because yesterday you said something in that session that you were right about, and I want to hear what you do when you have 4 songs and no one telling you you're wrong." And there was another silence, and then Philip Cross said, "I understand." And Frank Sinatra said, "Good. My office will send you the details," and hung up. And Philip Cross put down the telephone and sat in his apartment in the West Village for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, while the weight of what had just happened settled into something he could carry. What Philip Cross produced over the following 3 weeks was not what Frank Sinatra had expected, which was itself an achievement, because Frank Sinatra had expectations that were difficult to exceed, and that most people who worked with him for the first time merely met rather than surpassed. But Philip Cross had done something with the 4 standards that changed the quality of the light in which Frank Sinatra heard them, had found approaches to familiar material that were neither eccentric for the sake of eccentricity nor merely competent, but were instead the result of someone who had thought carefully about what each song was actually about beneath its surface, and had written arrangements that served those deeper meanings rather than the obvious one. And when Frank Sinatra listened to the arrangements for the first time, he sat through all 4 without stopping, and then said to no one in particular that they were very good, which from Frank Sinatra was a specific form of high praise, because very good meant that he had been surprised, and that his surprise had been pleasurable. And he recorded the 4 songs over 2 sessions with Philip Cross present for both. And during the sessions, Frank Sinatra treated Philip Cross as he treated every arranger whose work he respected, which was to say directly and without condescension, asking questions about specific choices, and offering observations and receiving Philip's explanations with genuine attention, rather than with the half-attention that famous singers sometimes gave to the technical people in the room. And Philip Cross understood in those 2 sessions that he was receiving something more valuable than a commission, or even the professional credibility that recording with Frank Sinatra would provide. He was receiving a model for how excellence treated other excellence, a demonstration that the hierarchy of the music industry did not have to operate the way it had operated in the session on West 44th Street, that it was possible for power and knowledge to exist in the same room without the power requiring the knowledge to diminish itself. The 4 recordings were released as part of an album that received the kind of critical attention that moved careers forward, and 3 of the reviews specifically mentioned the arrangements and named Philip Cross in a way that established him in the minds of people who booked arrangers for significant projects. And within 18 months, Philip Cross was working at a level that had taken other arrangers of his generation 5 or 6 years to reach, and he understood the role that Frank Sinatra's commission had played in this acceleration, without needing to inflate it into mythology, without pretending that his talent had not done the actual work, but also without pretending that talent operating in isolation would have found its way to the right rooms in the same time frame, because the industry was full of talented people who never reached the right rooms because no one with the right kind of access had ever pointed them in the right direction. Frank Sinatra and Philip Cross worked together on 3 subsequent projects over the following decade, and their professional relationship maintained the quality it had established in those first 2 sessions, direct and respectful and productive. The relationship of 2 people who understood music with sufficient depth to communicate about it without the usual protective performances. And when Philip Cross was asked in interviews about his early career, he spoke about Frank Sinatra's commission with characteristic precision, saying that what Frank Sinatra had done was not simply give him an opportunity, but had given him an opportunity that had the correct shape, meaning that it was large enough to show what he could do and specific enough that he could not hide behind its generality, and that this combination of scale and specificity was what distinguished a genuinely useful act of professional support from the kind that looked like support, but was really only the appearance of it. Frank Sinatra never discussed what he had seen in that failed session on West 44th Street, never mentioned the dismissal or his response to it in any interview or conversation that was reported, and the chain of causation between that afternoon and the commission remained invisible to everyone except Frank Sinatra, and perhaps Philip Cross, who had intuitions about it that he never tested by asking directly. And this invisibility was not accidental, but was the natural result of Frank Sinatra's understanding that the value of a thing done correctly was in the doing and not in the being known to have done it. And the autumn of 1964 in New York, with its urgent seasonal transition, and its taxi rides, and its obligatory dinners, and its failed session, and its phone calls made at 9 in the morning, continued to recede into the past, while Philip Cross's career extended itself forward through the years with the specific quality of something that had been properly founded, built on arrangements that had served the deeper meanings of songs rather than their obvious surfaces, which was perhaps the most accurate description of what Frank Sinatra had done as well, had found the deeper meaning of a situation and served that rather than the obvious one. And in this way, the music and the act that had made the music possible were expressions of the same understanding, the understanding that what things were really about was almost never what they appeared to be about on the surface, and that the people who grasped this were the ones whose work lasted, whether that work was an arrangement of a standard or a commission offered to a 24-year-old in a West Village apartment on an October morning in New York.